Uh, so you have been warned. Welcome everybody to our session discussing Dr. John Adali's Metaphysical Institutions, Islam and the Modern Project. My name is Munjed Murad, and I'm the moderator, the presider for this session. I shall begin with a brief introduction to this book that we're discussing, and then proceed with presentations by Dr. Celene Ibrahim, Dr. Nicholas Boylston, and Dr. Shankar Nair, followed by Dr. John Adali's response to those presentations, followed by roundtable discussion, followed finally by an audience Q&A. So please, as you listen to everyone else, collect your questions and comments as well, and save them for the Q&A session scheduled for the end of our roundtable discussion. When organizing this session, I found that the philosophy of religion unit the philosophy of religion unit seemed most appropriate for discussing this book, because it is primarily a book about about religion as such, and about the different how do I describe such a work in just a few words? Let me depend on the descriptions that's at the end of this book. So I shall be paraphrasing much that's at the end of this book, but it explores concepts, thinking, definitions, and the need for them in an age in which terms are often used very differently in discussions shared by different people. It uses the intellectual encounter. This book uses the intellectual encounter between Islam and modernity, or what Dr. Dali calls the modern project, to explore the nature of culture, civilization, religion, and tradition. Dr. Dali explores the ultimate nature of the realities that we call, as I said, religions, cultures, civilizations, and traditions through the lens of a particular question often limited to religious studies, history, and anthropology, namely, what is Islam? The book is a philosophical treatise, thoroughly. It's a philosophical treatise about the nature of shared thinking, and it uses the encounter between the modern project and Islam as an illustrative example. Out of the three parts of the book, it's only the third that goes into Islam in particular and the modern project. The first two are dedicated to exploring definitions, setting up a framework for discussing religion and for discussing metaphysical institutions. And there's more to be said about this book, and I shall leave it to our presenters, but I can say that it has been received very positively by such figures as Sherman Jackson, Muhammad Farouk, the author of the critically acclaimed Sculpting the Self, Islam, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing, by Asma Asfaruddin, who was supposed to present initially today, but unfortunately, because of her travels, was not able to join us. And also critically acclaimed by Dr. Muhammad Rustum. Now, before I turn it over to our first presenter, just a very brief introduction to Dr. Dali himself, since this book that we're discussing. Dr. Dali is the Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the College of the Holy Cross, and he's the author of books in Sufism and in intellectual history, Ibn al-Arabi and Islamic intellectual culture, from mysticism to philosophy, a translation of the famous mystical philosophical text, Fusus al-Hikam, of Ibn Arabi, the Ringstones of Wisdom, and also a co-editor of the tome, the study Quran, a translation and commentary on the Quran that brings together commentaries from across the Islamic tradition. And now we shall begin with our presentations. And we begin with Dr. Ibrahim's presentation. And before each presentation, I shall introduce the presenter. Dr. Celene Ibrahim is a multidisciplinary scholar specializing in Islamic intellectual history, gender studies, and ethics. She's best known for her award-winning monograph, Women and Gender in the Quran. Dr. Ibrahim is also the author of Islam and Monotheism, which is an accessible primer on core Islamic beliefs, and she's the editor of the anthology of One Nation Indivisible, Seeking Liberty and Justice from the Pulpit to the Streets. She's written also on spiritual care, chaplaincy, religious leadership, and relevant themes. She brings much to the table, and I myself very much look forward to hearing from her. Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murad, and thank you for our panelists. We're so excited and generous, Dali, for being with us and being able to discuss this work. So I'll say a few remarks, and then I'm actually going to share some slides and some graphics that are taken directly from the book to really do it justice. So metaphysical institutions investigate scholarly conventions for describing social phenomena and critiques the powers and limits of language for theorizing complex social realities. By thinking through these definitional problems in religious studies and related disciplines, including the porous boundaries between religion and culture, or culture and civilization, and tradition and other things, Dali seeks to delineate a space within which social theorists of various kinds can more accurately describe the realities propagated through human efforts to organize and theorize around issues of metaphysical concern. So the book's call for linguistic precision concerns Islamic studies most immediately, but also extends to adjacent humanities disciplines. So social theorists and analytic philosophers interested in language use and limits will also find this book rewarding. So the project is not just deconstructive, and this is the part I really appreciate, but the matrix that is given in the first chapters allow us to theorize better what is real, what is possible, what is good. That is the metaphysical dimensions of human existence, or metaphysical institutions, as Dali would term it. So from the outset, the monograph draws inspiration from the interdisciplinarity of the Islamic tradition itself. And chapter 1 then begins with the conceptual gaps and hurdles and the generations-long definitional dead ends, great phrase, in the field of religious and cultural studies that tend to reproduce these chronic imprecisions, incoherencies, and ambiguities. And here Dali really digs in, and it's hard to even have language to talk about the book because after reading it, I'm so conscientious about the language that I'm using. So Dali considers this tetrad of concepts, religion, culture, civilization, and tradition, and unpacks these ad hoc folk usages that we find in the literature that are not adequate for definitional accounts and not adequate for using these terms across different disciplines. But yet we find these terms are ubiquitous in humanities writing, and even the idea of a structure or a construct, which I'm also guilty of using over and over again in my writing, is that actually these architectural metaphors, is that actually the right way to talk about metaphysical institutions? So chapter 2, against this backdrop of the inadequacies of our current language, aspires for a theoretical framework that is coherent, correct, and sufficiently complex without being overly complex. So this task requires theorizing consciousness itself, the relationship between individuals and then wider collective systems of thought. So Dali's task is animated by this awareness that definitions are only as good as their most ambiguous term, as he says, and that human beings were not islands of thought, but we're not simply intersections either, that something dynamic and unique is happening at every kind of point in this a metaphysical institution's life, we could say. So the result is this rich matrix of questions that a historian or a social theorist can map onto any given composite of human beings that constitute an institution. So what then is an institution? So Daly offers a scrupulous, multifaceted definition of what is an institution. And that is based on different triads of concepts. And here's where I think it's most helpful to actually go to some graphics that are drawn from the book. And just someone give me a thumbs up. Is it displaying okay for everyone? Good. Okay. So, I might just have to display it not in slide mode, but just in this mode so that I can also see some of my notes. So that hopefully is still displaying okay for you. So along one column, we have these ideas of community, practice, and legacy. So who the institution is the community. The activities the institution does is the practice. And what the institution has is a legacy in kind of simplistic terms. And these are going to get richer and richer as we go. And across the top, you'll see that there's the variables of stability, dynamism, and purpose. So each term in the second triad applies to the initial three constituent elements. And therefore, we come to this definition whereby stability lines up with community to get memory. And then it becomes a ninefold grid in terms of theorizing institutions. And Daly goes through very systematically each of these intersecting grids and has a series of probing questions that one could ask about institutional life at any one of those intersections. So it's so rich, and I encourage everyone to check it out. But the matrix doesn't just stop there. There's another triad, accounts, heuristics, and norms, that are then also overlaid onto the original 9x9 matrix. And so you see here, the book is rich in analogies, and one of the analogies is kind of this journey that an institution or people on a journey. And so here you have one of the quotes from the book that talks about that journeying metaphor, where the shared sense of a destination would be the purpose. Now, when we come to accounts and heuristics and norms, you see here's where we can really delve into the richness and the sophistication and the complexity of any given institution. And so I'm not going to read through everything, obviously, but you can see here how these three categories for then what constitutes each of these matrices. So then here is we could say the 27-part matrix of how to think theoretically about an institution. So it's an ambitious project, as you see, and it's also quite useful, which is what I'll talk about now. So Daly's framework can apply broadly, for instance, to the institution of education in any given polity, or more narrowly to higher education, or more narrowly still to any given university or department within that university. So this framework is almost like a social science microscope where the scale can be adjusted in or out according to what a particular theorist is interested in. So hierarchy, there's several variables. These are the essential variables in this particular 7-part matrix. And Dr. Daly, since you're on here, you can correct anything that you'd like to add more sophistication to. But there's elements that are the fixed elements, which we just saw, and there's elements that are the more variable elements of institutions. So here we have the category of hierarchy, which, as you see, ranges from egalitarian to elitist. And there's a whole series of questions to think about as one would go through thinking about how hierarchy manifests in a particular institution. And then we have as well the categories, the sliding scale of how readily old and new practices are imbibed by the community of any given institution. And then there's the attendant questions to that particular variable. And then finally, there's this thinking about the modalities, the mediums through which the other variables can be conveyed, and essentially how legacy is then bequeathed from one generation to a next within that particular institution. So employing this matrix then in later chapters, Daly affirms and even amplifies the creative and emergent dimensions of Muslim doctrinal, jurisprudential, didactic, and literary knowledges, while also demonstrating their continuity and rootedness. So as theorists, we generally talk about continuity and change, but here we have a very sophisticated matrix that helps us articulate exactly points of consistency and variability. So then Daly wades through the theoretical intricacies of 4 seminal academic works later on, and I'm going to let my colleagues talk about that part of the book in order to describe what can accurately be labeled as Islamic. So rather than just kind of putting that term over all types of things, we need a rubric, we need a system for discerning what is Islamic or what is something else. So here, the work really pushes proactively and provocatively against certain maybe landmines in the field of Islamic studies that lead to inconsistencies or just unhelpful characterizations of the intellectual tradition or Muslims writ large. Chapter 8 in particular, I'll say, though I won't talk about it much, I would consider it essential reading for a theory and methods class in religious studies or in anthropology. So it's very probing and systematic and beautifully written. So now let me move slightly, and Munjed, I'm watching my time. I'll answer the question that my teenage daughter posed to me while she was reading Daly's book over my shoulder one evening. What is philosophy good for anyway? So even as this project offers tools and frameworks for disambiguation, which is a word, thank you, Dr. Daly, I will now insert that word more regularly into my own writing. So we have tools and frameworks for disambiguation. But this project is especially pertinent to those of us working in constructivist theological modalities. So I might have talked before about an imprecise spatial metaphor about working in tradition or within, using these kind of architectural metaphors. But after the book, I can have more sophisticated language to think about what does that mean to be a constructivist thinker within a metaphysical institution. So I can more precisely articulate the ways in which I'm rooted in community and practice and legacy in a way that is characterized by stability and dynamism and purpose, using the rubric. And I can also more readily specify which accounts, which heuristics, and which norms I might be assessing or even readdressing with any given article that I'm writing or activist intervention. So in my case, this entails drawing upon methodologies in women and gender studies, which as a field insists, as does Dr. Daly, that knowledges are situated within larger epistemic frameworks and that this necessarily constrains any given knower's perceptions or powers of articulation. So the precision of his framework for theorizing institutions offers really helpful language to be able, for those of us who are invested in female well-being, to talk about the precise interventions that we're making in the apparatuses of Islamic knowledge production, and for many of us also in the field of Islamic studies within the academy. So within both metaphysical institutions. And I think I need about 2 more minutes here. But the variable categories of hierarchy, this idea of the balance of the old and new expressions of practice, and the mediums through which we're seeking to bequeath legacy are 3 useful rubrics for thinking about how, as feminist theorists, we are reconfiguring gender-based hierarchies, emphasizing more egalitarian and female-affirming expressions of practice, and attempting to ensure that females and other non-dominant groups are represented in the legacies that are bequeathed. So it fits the matrix that Dali has outlined fits very nicely into a way to articulate what someone similarly positioned to me would be attempting. So finally, I want to push myself to think, and maybe as a panel we can also tackle this question of where the legacies of this modern project, the institution of the modern project, and the institution of Islamic knowledge, the Islamic intellectual metaphysical institution, where those legacies in fact do overlap, given that we as individual people might be parts of various institutions simultaneously. But all in all, the book really hammers a nail into the coffin that I hope will bury for good the paradigm where scholars propagate static or inappropriate reductionist language and knowledge about Islam. And I suspect that I'm also going to find the book very helpful going forward in articulating how feminist epistemologies can challenge hierarchies and bring novel insights and generate new modalities of engagement without subverting, destabilizing, or negating the foundations of the metaphysical institution. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing here.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, and for connecting that to the particular study of gender. And we have much material to return to in the roundtable discussion that follows. Next, we turn to Dr. Nicholas Boylston, who is assistant professor of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. He is a scholar of classical Persian literature and of Persianate Islam. His research focuses on themes of diversity and unity in the writings of Sufis, philosophers, and literateurs from the Persianate world. He also researches the flourishing of perspectivist and pluralistic modes of thought during the final stage of the formative phase of classical Persian literature. He also studies the interactions between Twelver Shi'ism and Sufism in Persianate literary Quran commentaries. He was also on my dissertation committee, and it's a pleasure to see him here on a panel. And Dr. Boylston, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murad, for organizing this, to Dr. Dala for this incredible book and for being with us to discuss it, and to Dr. Ibrahim and Dr. Nair for the really already very fruitful discussion. So Dr. Dala's Metaphysical Institutions does three things. Part one crafts this complex and nuanced definition of institutions that Dr. Ibrahim has already outlined for us. Part two examines the necessary metaphysical questions that have to be asked and answered before one can think coherently about human beings thinking together, which is what an institution is. And this part of the book, which is the most tightly argued and probably the most provocative, leads to the claim that it's impossible to coherently study human collectivities thinking together from anti-dualist, which means basically materialist or physicalist foundations. This part deserves a great deal of discussion, but it's not going to be my focus here. And part three applies the insights developed over the first two parts to critique definitions of Islam and the Islamic posed by Marshall Hodgson, Shahab Ahmed Talal Asad, and A. Kevin Reinhart, which has the effect of arguing for the superiority of Dala's own approach to Islam as a metaphysical institution. So Dala keenly points out that definitions are always constructed based on our particular motivations for defining in the first place. We're always situated somewhere when we define things, and recognizing this, the need for a definition of Islam and the Islamic may simply disappear when we look at where we're standing or make clear what we're looking for. As for example, when one realizes that for a certain set of questions, is X Islamic actually means is X halal or haram? Though there's a whole other range of types of questions that Dala goes into. In light of this, I also will involve my inquiry into the usefulness and potential limits of Dala's framework from one set of my own interests, namely the interactions between Sufism and Twelver Shi'ism, which in Dala's framework are metaphysical institutions. I'm particularly interested in what we could call institutional simultaneity, the particular complexities that arise through participation in competing metaphysical institutions. So one of the challenges of studying the interactions between Sufism and Twelver Shi'ism and other examples of multiple religious belonging is that we need to have a clear idea of what is interacting. And here Dala's insights about the way the terms religion, culture, civilization, and tradition are palpable. The challenges of defining Sufism, which is where I'll focus my attention due to limitations of time, are particularly well known in the field. Many introduction to Sufism types of work refuse to define it, and the common definition of Islamic mysticism is of little help here, since Twelver Shi'ism is also mystical. So this is an area in which tools such as those provided by the book Metaphysical Institutions are desperately needed. I'll show the kind of work methodologically that this part of Dala's book can do by comparing it to one of the most useful definitions of Sufism in the field to date. So in Sufism, A Global History, Niall Green offers, and I quote, and Dr. Murad's going to put it in the chat, Niall Green offers, and I quote, a basic definition of Sufism as a powerful tradition of Muslim knowledge and practice, bringing proximity to or mediation with God, and believed to have been handed down from the Prophet Muhammad through the saintly successors who followed him, end quote. Green emphasizes the, and I quote, quintessentially relational profile of Sufism as the sum total of similar sets of relationships between saints and their followers, between readers and writers of Sufi texts, between the Prophet, the mediating master, and the humble believer, between the subjects and objects of the devotion that's been the emotional heartbeat of the Sufi tradition, end quote. So Green's actually doing two things here as I read him, and my clarity in reading him actually has been a result of reading Dala's book and all the clarity he brings to this kind of analysis. So Green is, number one, is saying what traditions are. They involve knowledge and practice and are fundamentally relational, being for him the sum total of relationships, which are mainly relationships of authority. And number two, Green is identifying Sufism as a particular tradition through its purpose, that is proximity to or mediation with God, through its particular lineages, which is akin to pointing Sufism in history and saying it's this, and also Sufism's self-awareness as a tradition. Now let's consider again Dala's definition of an institution, which he defines as an instance of shared thinking in a relationship of community, practice, and legacy, characterized by stability, dynamism, and purpose, and constituted by accounts, heuristics, and norms, which Dr. Ibrahim laid out for us. So the kind of work this can do becomes clearer when we compare it with Green. To define Sufism as a metaphysical institution would be a similar type of definition to that of Green, since a tradition is a certain type of metaphysical institution. There are also clearly some overlapping features. Practice, for example, is shared between the two definitions, and the idea of relationality in Green does some of the work that Dala's idea of community does. But it also becomes clear that Dala's framework opens up a great many possibilities for inquiry. While Green's definition does do helpful work in examining Sufi-Shi relations, directing us to look at knowledge and practice, relationality among participants, particular lineages, and the way Shi Sufis describe themselves. But Dala's framework does this type of work and a lot more. Crucially, it's not simply a list of 9 features of an institution, but a systematically formulated account of the relationships between them. And it is at the intersection of these 9 categories that much of the interesting work can be done. And I think my reading of the book is quite similar to Dr. Ibrahim's. We're quickly seeing how useful this is for our own work. So after Dala's work, we can therefore ask complex questions like, what purposes are at work in a 14th century Twelver Shi Sufi author's curation of the legacy of Sufism to adapt the heuristics of this tradition to his context and community? So we have all one, the interaction between purposes, legacy, heuristics, context, and community, as well as the implied category of authority. And we can also examine that question again and see if it's well formulated. How do all of these things interact, and have any of them overlapped with each other? And actually turns out, in light of Dala's analysis, all of those terms, those 5 terms, are doing different things in this question. So I think there's certainly a great deal of power to the first part of the book, Metaphysical Institutions, for the kind of definitional work that's important to me in thinking about multiple belonging in metaphysical institutions. But while Sufism and Twelver Shi'ism are both metaphysical institutions, they're metaphysically compatible. What happens when there's participation in two metaphysical institutions that are not compatible? This is the question that raised itself for me when reading this book to the end. And if we follow Dahler's line of argument here, we have a fascinating example in front of us, and that is Dahler's book itself, a point of which I'm sure he's aware. Now, if we use Dahler's own framework to examine his own book, we can examine how the book Metaphysical Institutions relates to each of the 9 dimensions of his definition. I'll be relatively brief here, but taking the first triad in the definition, community, practice, and legacy, my analysis would be that while including Muslim members' practices and ideas as part of the project, the community, practice, and legacy that is presupposed by this book is actually the European Academy, which is part of the modern project. However, as I briefly mentioned, part 2 of the book involves a rejection of the very metaphysical foundations of this project as he sees them. Does this mean that Dahler's work is fundamentally wrong-headed? I suggest not. But the reason why requires that we think carefully about the relationships between the modern project and the Euro-American Academy, which we're participating in right now by virtue of being in this conference. And we use Dahler's second triad, stability, dynamism, and purpose to do so. First, however, it's worth noting the obvious fact that Dahler's work is not the first to trouble the dynamics of superiority and domination involved in the Western Academy's study of Muslims. This is, of course, at the heart of post-colonial theory and the decolonial project, which is a lineage in which I would be inclined to place Dahler's work, though he doesn't do this himself. As we survey this strand of the study of Islam, in which I would include Said's Orientalism, Halak's restating Orientalism, and then Dahler's metaphysical institutions, we can see that the relationship of the Euro-American Academy to the modern project is in fact dynamic. All of us here are not only participating in the Euro-American Academy, but we're changing it to different degrees. As we participate in this change, I suggest that Dahler is asking us to do so in more radical ways than Said or Halak have done. Both Orientalism and restating Orientalism are paradigmatically Foucauldian, though we could discuss if they are so in completely reductive ways or not. And Dahler would no doubt point out that Foucault himself is part of the modern project. Dahler's work, therefore, can be read as pointing to an even more rigorous form of decolonization, one that goes down to the very metaphysical roots of thinking. He's writing within the Euro-American Academy, but is attempting to shake it to its foundations, raising again the challenge of the fact that this book is at odds with the institution in which it is participating. If the hegemony of one subset of metaphysical beliefs is removed from an institution, does the institution fragment and fall apart? Or does one have to leave to join an academy with foundations that one can accept? Dahler's framework, again, provides the keys to a promising way forward. Rather than abandoning the project of the Euro-American Academy, I read Dahler as asking us to transform it, a task that immediately brings to mind the second triad of Dahler's definition of institutions, and particularly its third member, namely purpose. It is, in fact, possible to have an institution that has a shared set of purposes, such as increasing knowledge, cultivating humanity, and expressing beauty in linguistic form, that is not completely metaphysically determined, and may indeed be metaphysically pluralistic. Precisely such an institution existed in the Islamic tradition, namely adab, a shared project of literary and ethical production that was cosmopolitan in its community and legacy. If we read Metaphysical Institutions closely, it is precisely such a project that Dahler is calling us to, in which shared values of rationality and goodness enlighten a collective journey, and which metaphysical hegemony does not belong to those who deny rationality and goodness to begin with. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Boylston. If only I'd read this book and heard your presentation as I was trying to define Sufism for my own work previously, my own dissertation. You your point, your examination of the book echoes a Persian Sufi literary method of self-examination of the literature in expounding its own metaphysical points. Thank you, Dr. Boylston. I'm sure that we will return to a number of the points that you made shortly. First, we move to Dr. Shankar Nair, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, as well as the department's Director of Graduate Admissions and MA programs. His research covers many fields, but especially Sufism and Islamic philosophy, Quranic exegesis, Hindu philosophy and theology, Muslim-Hindu interaction in South Asia, Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit literatures, and South Asian religions. He researches the religious and intellectual history of the Indian subcontinent, particularly as it relates to broader traditions of Sufism and Islamic philosophy, Quranic exegesis, and Hindu philosophy and theology, especially Advaita, Vedanta, and other forms of Hindu non-dualism. He's the author of the critically acclaimed book, Translating Wisdom, Hindu-Muslim Intellectual Interactions in Early Modern South Asia. And we look forward to listening to him now.
Thank you so much, Munjed and Celene and Nicholas. These have been very helpful overviews and thoughts and provocations to hear. Of course, thank you above all to Professor Chandra Dagla. This book was a delight to read, extremely thought productive. The term institution, I think it's a wonderful introduction, a very strategic choice, a word that doesn't have the baggage of other terms. I say this as someone who has banged his head against a wall for years to try to use words like religion, like tradition, and to encounter just a wall of thick presuppositions and deeply held presumptions, and often very emotional responses as well. So I think it's a wonderful choice, and I look forward to using this term in my work going forward. Slightly more comically, I'll also thank you for bringing the word Aeneid back into modern English scholarship. I loved that word when I first encountered it as a kid. Thank you for not using nonet. Aeneid is a much better word. I'll also say that I very much look forward to the next book, so tantalizingly teased in the very first footnote of the book on the modern project, which is, of course, animating this entire book in a way, and I can't wait to hear your future thoughts. And I hope that in some small way, our conversation here today can help develop that project further. So there's so many ways I could praise this book, but I know time is very short, so please just know that the praise is there. I will just focus on a few short sections that I have time for to try to push you, press you, provoke you, as is my norm, my want in book panels. I'll start with your overall framing for the book, the pitch for the book that you're providing for us in the early chapters, namely the voices that you're trying to argue against or to critique in a sort of, I think, Suhrawardi-esque kind of move, right? You tackle the utility of the project of defining Islam, culture, religion, civilization, tradition, and so forth and so on. I take your critiques in good hand and benefit from them very well. The way that I'd like to press you a bit into hear your further thoughts, as someone who was myself trained in religious studies, there's a sort of history to each of these big definitions. And I wonder if appreciating the history by which these different definitions have come about helps us to approach them and potentially critique them in a slightly different way, right? You have yourself written a book that is about collective thinking, right? As a community, over time, over generations. Each of these definitions, right? Your Talal Asad definition, your Shahab Ahmed definition, etc., didn't emerge from the rarefied air out of some kind of vacuum, but was itself a product of an accumulation of scholarship, a perceived sense of discontent with existing conceptualizations, and this resulted in a motivation to try to reconceptualize so as to, right, improve the analysis. And I wonder if, since your account doesn't provide that history and it doesn't seem to factor in your account and your critique of these definitions if there's something lacking there. I wonder if a sort of Thomas Kuhn kind of model from his famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is a bit closer to what's going on here, right? You have your paradigm, you have your concept, you have your theory, say Newtonian physics. And as more experiments are done, more things are observed, the data that is accumulated doesn't add up to the concept or to the paradigm. And so a tweak has to be made for some reason or other to try to explain things better. To take an example that is well known to Sanskrit philosophy, and Islamic philosophy has its own versions, it's like a definition is relative to an audience and to the needs of that audience, right? And if they have never seen, say, a water buffalo before, you give not some sort of, again, from the rarefied air, from the ether, absolute definition of a water buffalo that's supposed to stand for all people, all times, all contexts, and all places, but rather a sort of running definition that's pragmatically useful to help this person recognize a water buffalo when they get there. I would argue that your Talal Asad, your Shahab Ahmed, etc., are dealing with things in this sort of way. As scholarship has accumulated and discontent grows with prior conceptualizations that have dominated the field. I don't think it would be controversial to any of us to look at the sorts of conceptualizations of Islam in the Western Academy 100 to 150 years ago, which would somewhat cartoonishly depict Islam as this essentially dry, legalistic, rote religion that is essentially Islamic law. When that is your starting conceptualization, of course, things like philosophy, things like Sufism can only be explained as a result of, say, foreign influence, right? Growing discontent with the way that clear, observed historical data doesn't line up with that conceptualization forced the field to rethink things, right? And now there's more space than ever, thank goodness, to think about Arabic philosophy as Islamic philosophy, or to think about Sufism as part of the heart and soul of Islam, whereas prior conceptualizations didn't allow us to, right? I would argue that a Shahab Ahmed definition or a Tal Asad definition or a Reinhardt definition emerges out of that kind of history. You don't give that history, which I worry it ends up being too dismissive of that process, right? Of that background, of the institutions, if you will, that led to such definitions. But the work is, of course, not done. I think of, for example, in my own context, the Rishi tradition of Kashmir, right? Which is, to use an old language, a syncretic tradition, a tradition that is deeply, quote unquote, influenced by Hindu traditions, that adopts Hindu architecture, poetry, et cetera, and yet the members of the Rishi movement do overwhelmingly tend to self-identify as Muslims, right? Our field is reconceptualizing in ways that I find very useful to allow us to think of a tradition like this as Islamic, right? At least in some deeply relevant way, in ways that prior conceptualizations didn't allow us to. And whereas you, especially in the early sections of the book, would tend to dismiss such conceptualizations using language like it doesn't allow for analysis, it's analytically useless, or that these are merely folk concepts, or they resign us to a mere know it when you see it kind of fallacy. I would argue instead that there is real analytical usefulness here. Now, these conceptualizations have many metaphysical implications that the field almost never recognizes. And so you are absolutely right to call our field to recognize those implications. But to simply say that it is a mere note when you see it kind of circularity or a kind of analytically useless conceptualization, I would argue that's not the case. It's allowing me, for example, to argue against the nationalist narratives of Hindu nationalists, let's say, or a Pakistani narrative of a particular version of Islam that doesn't line up with history. Or one could look to the contributions of Black studies, allowing us to look at somebody like Malcolm X as truly Islamic in a way where he wouldn't have been able to be thought of as such before. That took longer than I thought. All right, maybe just two more critiques, and then I will turn it over to Professor Dagla. These sorts of thoughts make me wonder if the gap between the framework that Professor Dagla is offering us on the one hand, and the voices and the trends in the field that he's critiquing on the other, is really quite as wide as he makes it out to be. Again, there's an urgent critique that's laid out in part 2, which quite rightly shines a bright light on the implicit anti-dualism, right, a physicalist, materialist anti-dualism that underpins a whole lot of the humanities and the social sciences today. And there's little question about this. Although I wonder if, again, Dagli is a little bit too reductionist. He's trying to do so much in this book. Perhaps there is a slightly greater plurality available in the context of modern philosophical debates. I wonder if there are still more substance dualists, or at least property dualists still around, kicking around, than he might suggest. Paradigms that try to make use of evolutionary explanations, a sort of Karl Popper approach. But I think most relevantly, the vibrant arena of Christian analytic philosophers who don't feature in the picture, right? Your Thomist circles, Plantinga, David Bentley Hart types. May these be thought of as iterations of modern philosophy that are resisting some of these anti-dualist trends. But that's a side note. Douglas quite right, I think, that there is little space for disagreement, robust disagreement with the kind of physicalist anti-dualism that underpins a whole lot of the modern humanities and social sciences today. It's extremely narrow space, and it has been for quite some time. But the contextual constructivism that has now come to the fore in a whole lot of the humanities, Dagla depicts it as a thoroughgoing handmaiden of these very same physicalist or materialist anti-dualist metaphysics. I wonder if we could instead think of these sorts of constructivist interventions, right? The idea that it is context, social context, political context, etc., cultural context that shapes us and forms us. While no doubt emerging out of an anti-dualist kind of context, I wonder if we can think of such interventions as in fact supporting precisely the sorts of interventions that Chandra is trying to make here. And what needs to be iterated instead is that these sorts of interventions actually imply a different kind of metaphysics, and the field has not yet recognize that because they're in the habit of ignoring metaphysics. So in other words, there could be a kind of potential ally here, rather than needing to conceptualize these dominant trends in the fields of the humanities as simply part of that other, which needs to be separated off and pushed aside. Apologies if that was a bit unclear. I'm trying to speed up. The last thing that I will say, and then I'll turn it over, is towards the end of the book, Professor Dagla, again, I think quite rightly, points to Western scholarship's habit of viewing itself as coming from the perspective of nowhere, right? It projects itself as neutral. It projects itself as universal. And he's, of course, undoubtedly right about that. But the field, I would argue, has come to recognize its own provinciality, more so in the past couple decades than it ever used to before. Again, great deal of more work needs to be done, but it seems important to recognize that those steps have been taken. And again, this isn't really a substantive disagreement so much as one of rhetoric or pitch. I would argue that we have potential allies here, again, that the framing of the book doesn't allow us to recognize. Religious studies has, more and more so, tended to recognize itself as its own kind of provincial contextual discourse, standing alongside other discourses. Now, the usual move is to say that Islamic thought is something that happens over there. We have our own discourse, our own concepts, our own goals, our own motivations, which are different from those. A lot of that is, of course, as we've seen, nonsense, right? There are power dynamics at play, right? The global power of English language scholarship, right? There's not a neutrality there, as the field would often put it. But again, there is this more vibrant than ever recognition of the provinciality of this discourse. To Professor Boylston's suggestions, I wonder what it might mean to think of this religious studies, for example, today as one metaphysical institution standing alongside other ones, right? And what it might mean to co-inhabit different discourses. The same sort of insight might apply to Professor Douglas' concluding comments on anti-essentialism. He's quite right that in the everyday world, there really is no such thing as an actual anti-essentialist skeptic or an anti-essentialist moral relativist. None of us live that way. But again, thinking about the history of the field and thinking about its very desperately slow progress toward recognizing its own provinciality, I wonder if the anti-essentialism that tends to dominate modern day religious studies has a pragmatic use in the longue durée. Again, not in the context of a given scholar. They're essentializing all the time and failing to recognize it. Again, Professor Douglas is exactly right to call them out. But in the longue durée, that anti-essentialism is the product of a field recognizing its own legacy of racism and colonialism and not wanting to project that hubris all over again. And so for future generations of scholars, that anti-essentialism again, can be harnessed as a kind of epistemological humility. We may learn more about these civilizations in the coming year, which will force us to rethink the way that we've thought about Islam, religion, tradition, etc. And that anti-essentialism is kind of pragmatic as a way of allowing that rethinking to happen in a way that the field in its hubris in earlier decades would have resisted, thinking, of course, we know everything, we are scientific Europe. But what never happens, once again, to beat a dead horse, what never happens is a reckoning with the metaphysical implications of that anti-dualism. And so that needs to happen. And I applaud Professor Dagla for calling the field to do exactly that and to recognize each and every one of us, our own embeddedness within our own metaphysical institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nair, for that analysis and for thinking of how we could take this, how we could further this discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Nair. Dr. Dali, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Munjed and Nicholas, Celene, Shankar. I'm very honored that everyone took the time and the effort to read, and I'm very glad that there were some good things that were found in the book, and I'm extremely stimulated and rethinking already some of the holes that I left in maybe some of my argumentation. Maybe for a future edition or a future book, we can include some of these things. And so I want to address some of the things that were mentioned somewhat thematically. There were a few things here, and I'm going to go in maybe no particular order here, but one perhaps ambiguity, or let's say a little bit of a lacuna that I left, was perhaps to not make quite clear. Well, let me actually step back for a second and say that in the writing of the book, I tried to be very disciplined about keeping the focus very narrow and very much on the argument and without spilling over into adjacent areas. Now, one of the areas that and Shankar picked up on it was I didn't talk about Christianity at all, which might seem like a strange thing to do in the context of a book that's talking about, the modern project. And, because after all, you can't fully understand the history of the modern project if you're not understanding that it came out of the Christian world. I mean, there's just no understanding its history fully without doing that. But what I wanted to do was to really focus on two things. One, the original motivation of the book, which was the encounter, this conceptualization of Islam discourse, which then grew to try to explain the metaphysical underpinnings of that and the implications of it and the presuppositions. And then having its interlocutor be a very, at least as much as I could, a narrowly conceived, or let's say a rigorously conceived is maybe a better way of saying it, a rigorously conceived modern project, right? So in my conception, the modern project as an institution is different from Christianity. It's not Christianity, right? So that's one thing to make clear. There are obviously modern Christians, but that's another matter altogether. That's one thing. A second thing, which I should have, I think, made more clear, and it's become more clear listening to all of you, is that the academy, that is to say, this network of people who are doing scholarship and writing and so forth, right, in modern intellectual life, That is to say, the modern academy and the modern project are not coterminous, right? So you have the university system, you have their administrators, the professors, researchers, intellectual life at a high level, more generally speaking. And then you have the modern project, and those are not necessarily the same. The classic example of that you mentioned was someone like David Bentley Hart. He's in the academic system, but you wouldn't call him a modern intellectual. He's not someone in the modern project. He's a Christian, but he's operating in a system that has people who are both modern in this ideological, or let's say in the sense of a metaphysical institution, and Christians together. So that's one thing to kind of make clear, is that if I gave the impression, that's probably maybe a sort of, I should have made that a little bit more clear. I'm not saying that if you look at the modern academic scene, it's a kind of a purely modern, that it's just a modern project writ large, right, from the top to the bottom. That's clearly not the case, right? Because we have many dissenters, there's people who have different views, there's people who look at things in a different way. The modern project is an actual way of looking at things. It's not just, you might say, a kind of the condition of power or of being in the modern world, or sort of being, it has a definite sort of identity to it. It has it's identifiable as a thing. So that's one thing that I wanted to make clear, which is that I'm not trying to say that everyone who's in the academic system is modern. Therefore, to operate within the academic system without being modern is a kind of a contradiction. I would agree that that's not the case, right? That there can be overlap. So that's something that I wanted to make clear. And so that brings us to that question of simultaneity and compatibility. The next so that's one thing to consider, is the question of whether the academy is, simply speaking, an extension of the modern project. It's not. If I can sort of maybe remind myself, and also just remind everyone, I never actually, even in the book, tried to define what Islam is. The purpose of the book was to set out the very conditions by which any possible definition could actually be made. But I didn't really give, although you could probably guess what my definition of Islam might be, or what constitutes the Islamic. But it doesn't actually provide a definition of the Islamic. What it does is it tries to provide a means by which you can get to some kind of systematic and coherent definition of a metaphysical institution like Islam. And moreover, it does the same thing for the modern project. The modern project is not really defined in a substantive way in the book either, although what I try to do is to begin to get at what it might be. Now, I think one approach, if we take the starting point of looking at the what is Islam question as a way of simply saying, look, find who you consider to be the authoritative Islamic community, and then you theorize what they're doing, and that is, in a sense, that is what is Islamic. Right? You can't do it without identifying that source of authority. And I make a complex argument in that regard. But you could do the same thing with the modern project. And what I attempt to do is to say, look, this thing I'm calling the modern project essentially has these three apex communities who each deal with different realms of metaphysics, right? The deep heart of what it means to be modern. And I say you have the world of science, the scientific community, which determines what is real, right? What is the nature of reality? You have the philosophical community, what Carsten Harries called philosophy world, sort of similar to the art world. The philosophy world, which talks about what is rational, or what are the right kinds of questions to ask. And then you have the world of art with a capital A, or culture with a capital C, right? And these are distinct communities, you might say. These are individuals with moral authority to say what the modern project is and is not, right? If these people think it's not modern, it isn't. And if they say that it is modern, it is. Quite simply, right? And so you have this way of identifying, well, what do you mean by modern project anyway? How do you know if something is modern or not? Well, one way of doing it is to identify the people who have the authority to say whether something is modern or not, whether something counts as being. So who gets to say, for example, what counts as philosophy? Those people are part of the apex communities who determine what the modern project is. And you can extend that into the art world. You can extend it to the world of science as well. Now, if I were to say myself, if I were to offer a substantive definition, some kind of substantive definition of the modern project, it's not so much a definition, but you might say a hallmark. It has two main attributes to it. One is that to be modern, to be part of this modern project, carves out a domain where God does not operate, or the sacred does not operate. In other words, in order for something to qualify as modern, there has to be a domain or a realm of reality where God, it's as if God does not exist, and within which human beings operate with complete autonomy. So it's those two things. There has to be a domain where human beings operate with complete autonomy, but that autonomy is characterized there's a condition, as it were. It's not just autonomy. It's an autonomy that operates as if God did not exist at all. Right. So you have this that I think characterizes everything that's called modern. Now, notice this is not the same as atheistic, because you can believe in God, but then still carve out a domain that is separate. But it can also include atheistic and anti-dualistic conceptions. So I did want to make that kind of, not clarification, but just to expand on things a bit, to say that I don't think that to be a modern academic means that you have to have these, that you subscribe to a particular set of metaphysical commitments. And I don't think that those metaphysical commitments completely dominate and sort of control every aspect of the modern intellectual enterprise in the West that we call the Euro-American Academy. However, it is pretty dominant, it seems to me. That is to say, to the degree that you have these other voices that are in there, you could characterize them as eccentrics or dissenters, or people who are very good at navigating the situation, who know how to be quiet, who know how to sort of make their voices heard. And you have these kind of eccentric institutions like Zaytuna, or some of the Catholic institutions to varying degrees, although they've, that's a whole, you could say a lot about that. But I would say that the dominant sort of reigning paradigm, to borrow the Kuhnian language, is that of the modern project, but it's not simply coterminous in that regard. And I think that helps us to answer some of the questions about that. Now, I had actually a question for Nicholas about this question of the adab traditions pluralism. Now, I take it, you mean by that, that is to say that not only Muslims, but also Christians and Jews and other religious communities participated in that tradition? Was that the import of what you were saying? Yeah, see that to me makes sense. And there I would agree with you that the academy could in fact become, it could be something like that, where you have this metaphysical pluralism within the existing practices and structures without there being a kind of a contradiction. But at the deep level of, if you say, for example, that you cannot be a scientist without believing in anti-dualism, then you have a straightforward contradiction. Then it is straightforwardly incompatible. But if you're a historian, or if you're an anthropologist, or if you're any one of these things, then it doesn't necessarily have to be one, although it can, as it were, turn out, it can turn out to be one. Shankar, you brought up a few points which I think are very, very important, and I'm going to try and just, I was noting them down as I was going. Number one, the use of the institution. Here, I want to spill a little bit of secret history and credit Munjed. In my original conception of the book, what I was trying to do, and I kind of mentioned this in the book, I thought that I would use the word tradition as the universalizing kind of rubric term that I could then extend to the other ideas. Munjed was talking this over with Dr. Said Hussein Nasser. And he did not like that move at all, intellectually speaking. And he thought that tradition should be not used in that particular kind of way, which that was a little bit of a club to the face in the progress of my book. But it did make me think, it did make me pause and kind of reconsider it. And then it took a while, but then I began to sort of formulate the idea that this idea of institution really works better, and really not just institution, but metaphysical institution. And that's how that crystallized. So Munjed, you deserve a little bit of credit for helping me get to what turns out to be a better term to use. Now, on the question of the history of these terms, I think there's something about that that's true. And I didn't really set out to tell that entire history, except to note that the history from the point of view of defining these terms had been a kind of a failure. That is, so if the desire was to create a kind of a helpful filtering mechanism by which you can sort of figure out, well, this counts as religious and this doesn't. This counts as being cultural and this doesn't. We can say that this is a cultural thing versus it would seem that after at least 50 and probably more like 100 years of attempts to do this, we really are in a situation where people are relying upon a kind of a folk intuition and trust in the sensibilities of people who have knowledge in order to be able to differentiate these things and give them a definition. I do want to say in my own defense, I wouldn't say that by saying that these are folk definitions or know it when you see it, that they're empty, right? It's not that when religious studies scholars identify religion that they don't know what they're talking about. I think they know what they're talking about, and especially within the field as it operates, when they talk about religion versus culture, there's this kind of implicit sense that they know what they mean when they say that. So it's not an empty designation. It's not that it doesn't mean anything, but it does have a kind of limit, right? And it's precisely those edge cases. It's precisely contested areas where definitions are supposed to be the most useful, right? That's the puzzle, right? Definitions are most useful where they're hardest to attain, which is those kind of borderline cases, right? If everyone agreed, then you wouldn't have the problem of definition in the first place. Now, with the case of Kuhn, who you mentioned, which is a very interesting parallel to use, I think there's the Kuhn of the broad intellectual culture, which is this idea of paradigms changing in science, and then there's the real Kuhn, who was a really radical constructivist when it came to some of these scientific concepts. I mean, the idea that it's not just that time is thought of differently in Newton versus in relativistic physics. They're just different entities altogether, and they cannot, in a sense, be translated one into the other. I mean, that's probably not the model that we want to go to and use for trying to understand these, you might say, these deeper concepts. I don't know, I can't remember if I put it in the book, but I mean, I think what we wind up being with some of these learned, I should say, if I want to emphasize that, learned conceptions of religion, culture, civilizations, and so forth. If people are familiar with this movie, Spartacus, where people stand up and say, I'm Spartacus, and then someone else stands up and says, I'm Spartacus, well, then how can you tell the difference if you don't already know who Spartacus is, if everyone is standing up and saying, I'm Spartacus? And in this case, this is the definition of religion. No, this is the definition of religion. No, this is the definition of religion. Now, those people can all be historically grounded and erudite and morally, and I take your point, morally and humbly responding to the history of the field. I don't doubt any of that. And I really tried my best to say that these are not questions of malice, although sometimes there is malice. It's really a question of self-image and coherence, right? This is really the question. What is the correct self-image of what is happening? And the second thing I would push back on, not just, is this question of the mode by which scholars have recognized their own provinciality. Yes, absolutely. People have said we have to move away from this Enlightenment hegemonic, view from nowhere or view from everywhere, however it is, and we need to move to a kind of a more humble sense of knowledge in our own situatedness and so forth as well. But the question is does this become a kind of a postmodern, relativistic, hyper-skeptical move, or is it actually true humility? Because when it takes the form of that kind of hyper-skeptical anti-essentialist move, in many cases, and I would say in the dominant cases, it does become a kind of a metastasized version of the universalizing tendency of the Enlightenment, which is to say, well, look, of course we don't, of course we can't know what the truth really is, and we can't know what morality really is. But also we're the first ones to understand that we can't know what truth and morality is, and we're the ones who best understand how to be sophisticated and talk about these things. And these Muslims now have these naive notions of truth and rationality and goodness, and we know better. So it just becomes a different modality of we know better. Now, if this humility is actually true, and by the way, it is, and you run into people like this in the academy all the time, but again, they're in the nature of dissenters and kind of eccentrics, I would say, against the broader project. And oh my goodness, I'm running out of time. There's so much to sort of talk about. Oh, and I'll leave it with one last comment. Again, so I hope it's clear that I don't think that all of the scholars working in the humanities and around Islam are completely a handmaiden to this modern project, because it's pretty clear that that's not the case. You can think of somebody like, Corbin or Massignon, or you can name many people who it would be impossible to characterize in that way. But again, it's a question of the dominant relationship and the kind of the way these relationships play out, specifically against that modern project rigorously defined and Islam rigorously conceived of, if that makes sense. Okay, those are just some of my responses. I wasn't able to respond to everything that everyone brought up, but those are I just wanted to leave a few minutes, my goodness, for maybe other questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dali, for that. I will, if anybody has any questions, raise a hand or send a message in the chat if you don't want it to be recorded, or if you want to be an anonymous. We will close in 2 minutes apparently. 90 minutes clearly is not nearly enough time to discuss an effort like this. I had a question to ask myself, but I guess I don't think that I have enough time to ask it. All right, Dr. Ogunnaike has raised a hand, so I will put forward my question, and Dr. Ogunnaike will ask his. I think we're allowed technically to go a few minutes past. Maybe we could go 15 minutes past at most, but I understand that one of our panelists has to teach a course. Dr. Ibrahim, thank you for joining us. I think technically at 3:30 Eastern time, this will close automatically.
There's a lounge link in the
There
chat.
is a lounge link as well.
Professor Doug, would you join us in the lounge if we went there?
Absolutely, yes.
All right,
yes.
all right. So let's move to the lounge. But let's just see.
How's that done?
All right, there's Jacob Robinson just sent out a lounge link. It's the second link.
Oh, should we all click into there? Is that the idea?
So we should do so. I don't know if it's recorded, but we will go over there now.
All right, I'm clicking into there then.